5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello again. I'm Michael Lund, and I'm welcoming you to the 4th meeting of Home and Abroad, an online writing seminar for veterans, military, and family members. I'm going to do a little backtracking today in order to look toward the conclusion of our seminar next week and the completion of your projects. In 1968, I was drafted into the military. I had not wanted to be a soldier, but was sent after time at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to Vietnam, and most fortunately, had good duty and returned whole. Once home, for 30 years, I didn't want to think about the military. I was happy my service was over. I was willing to let anyone who volunteered in the era after the active draft do whatever they were told to do. Until, of course, September 11th. On September 11th at 9:30 Eastern Time, just as my class, Introduction to World Literature, was about to begin, a student came in and told the rest of us that an airplane had hit the World Trade Center in New York. No one else knew anything about this, though, and we concluded it was just one of those small planes, a navigational error. Between that class and my 11 o'clock class, I learned the truth. Now, I can't recall what we were discussing that day, but I do remember exactly what was being read for Thursday, our next class meeting, when we had a more complete sense of what had happened in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. I had assigned books 5 and 6 of the Iliad, where the hero Hector prepares to fight outside the walls of his city in perhaps the most famous Western war of all time, the Trojan War. Wearing the armor in which he will live or die the next day, Hector seeks out his wife, Andromache. He is surprised to find that she is not in her quarters. A servant woman there tells him she is on the city walls, looking out at the scene of the next day's conflict. She has their infant son in her arms. When Hector finds his wife and child on the city walls, he asks her why she is not in her quarters, as the other women are. And in a profoundly sad way, she explains that she does not want to face what is coming. "You will be killed, my husband," she says. Now, this is my amateurish summary, not a literal translation. I'm not a classic scholar. Anyway, she says, "And your son will grow up never knowing what a great warrior you were, because he will be taken away to a distant land and made a slave to others. And, beloved husband, I too will be forced to leave my home to spend the rest of my days as wife to another, a man I cannot love. Or worse, I will become a common slave." And then she pleads, "Do not go to fight tomorrow." Hector answers calmly, surprising me every time I read his response or summarize it in my own words. "My wife," he might say, "I know what you say is true. The Greeks are mighty warriors, and assuredly one day I must fall to one of their heroes. And then, even if he is spared death, this boy will not know me, living far from Troy. And you, my wife, will be taken away to suffer shame and humiliation, the wife or servant of lesser men in an alien land." Homer seems to suggest this unhappy future when Hector reaches out for his son, because the boy does not recognize his father in his battle gear and pulls back afraid. But Hector concludes, "I know what you say is true, my wife, but I must go. I am a warrior. Fighting is what I must do." Now, on September 13th, I said to my students, and I have repeated this every semester I teach, one of you at least will, in the next 5 years, say to someone you love, "Don't go." But he or she will go because the fundamental principles of patriotism and sacrifice still exist today. I also say that in the next 5 years, one of you at least will say to someone you love who has asked you not to, "I must go." Which of you says these words and which hears these words given form by an ancient Greek several thousand years ago, I cannot say, because the reasons for going or not going are at the center of our national struggle right now. Whom do we fight? Whom do we not fight? Who takes up arms? Who does not? The questions apply to women as well as men now, of course. Even if we finally succeed in one conflict, there will be other battles. Did I know these things would happen before September 11th? I fear I did, because any study of history, including the study of literary history, my specialty, reveals that few generations avoid war. 2/3 of the men in my graduating high school class were in the military, and perhaps half of those served in Vietnam. Does this experience give us a perspective of our current national challenges? I say it does, and I find we have a deeper appreciation of the burden America's military and their families carry for us. Since only about 1% of the population now volunteers for these tasks, we need to find ways to help the 99% understand what is involved. Now, as I said at the beginning of these remarks, I didn't think I would ever take up this task. A teacher and a scholar of literary history, I did not anticipate writing about my own military experience. Unlike most of the other members of my unit in Vietnam, all journalists trained in or out of the Army, I did not say, when I get back from all this, I'm going to tell the true story of what's going on over here. And one early summer evening, perhaps 10 years after I came home, I mentally confirmed this resolution. At a church vestry meeting, after the minister had offered an opening prayer that God direct and bless our actions, one senior member added, "And remember those boys who gave their lives this day 40 years ago." It was the anniversary of D-Day. Eager to finish the meeting myself, get home to my wife and children, and continue preparations for the workday in the morning, I thought to myself, what's the matter with you, old-timer? World War II is ancient history. Get over it. And silently I renewed that vow I'd already made, never to become one of those tiresome veterans who can't move on, who find the rest of their lives insignificant compared to the intensity of that one experience. I have in general been true to that commitment, valuing the accomplishments of my personal and civilian professional life more than my very brief military career. However, in recent years, I have also found myself drawn back in memory and imagination to my time in Vietnam. The writing I've done in the last 5 years is one result of my inability completely to get over it. And among other things, this work is an apology to my fellow church member, now deceased, who prayed for his friends. My conviction not to remain stuck in the past was initially adopted on a specific occasion in Princeton, New Jersey, spring 1971. I was standing beside an open grave into which the body of a young soldier killed in Vietnam was about to be lowered. Stephen Warner's mother, his father, his younger sister, and family friends watched as military personnel, I was one member of that escort team, removed the flag from the casket, folded the stars and stripes in the honored triangular fashion, and handed it to the mother. I had been with the Warner family for several days, and I believe this would be my last act in a drama I had been caught up in 2 years earlier. When the ceremony at the gravesite and a small family gathering afterward concluded, I would go to a local motel where my wife, having traveled up from Virginia, would meet me. Within days, I would become again a civilian, having put to rest, may they rest in peace, the pains of my military life. Steve Warner had been, like me, a draftee. He had completed his undergraduate education at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania and gone on to his first year of law school at Yale, committed to the civil rights movement in this country and opposed to the war overseas. The Army selected him, as it had me, to be a correspondent, and he discovered, after he arrived in country, an unanticipated mission. He would tell the story of the infantry, the grunts. Armed with his notepad, pen, and camera, he began, as it was termed, humping the boonies and recording what he learned. One of those ironies of conflict you don't believe when you hear about it is true in his case. He had orders to go home before the last mission that took his life. He turned down the early out, offered as part of an accelerated drawdown, which President Nixon had mandated, in order to accompany one more time the unit he had gotten to know and whose story he was determined to preserve in word and picture. Traveling with that infantry platoon headed north in support of Allied forces during the Laotian incursion, he was caught in an ambush and died from the explosion of a rocket-propelled grenade. Because I was within days of the end of my 2-year enlistment, our unit's commanding officer assigned me to travel back with the body as an official military escort. We flew out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base to Hawaii, on to Oakland, California. Tucked away in my pocket on that journey was a letter addressed to Steve's family with which he had entrusted me some months earlier. Composed before he began going into the field, and including several postscripts as those operations continued, it made clear that, should anything happen to him, they were all to understand he had chosen this path. He insisted that he had never felt his life more meaningful than it was in his role as reporter, documenting for the nation the heroism and selflessness of his fellow soldiers. From Dover Air Force Base, I would ride in the hearse carrying his body to Steve's hometown. In a room adjacent to the morgue, where I saw a number of mortuary affairs specialists preparing remains for burial, I was outfitted with a uniform that probably was intended for a dead man. They would be the clothes I wore home to Virginia, the ones that hang to this day in the closet of my upstairs bedroom. An officer and another enlisted man who had performed escort duties before were in charge of the process from Dover to Princeton. When it was clear I would be in Princeton for several days before the funeral, the Warners insisted I stay with them at their home, rather than in quarters provided by the Army. I slept in Steve's bed. Because I had no civilian clothes, they asked me to wear some of his clothes, and of course I complied. I ate at their table. In an unhappy exchange, it seemed as if I was, for 48 hours, Stephen Warner having come home from war. We all wept, however, on the day he was buried. As the bugle sounded taps, the guns saluted, the flag was folded. Steve had such vision in 1971 that he instructed his family in that same epistle that I carried. Should he not return alive, they were to donate his journal, his letters, and his pictures to his undergraduate institution, Gettysburg College. Some of them are available today online at that library's Special Collections website. And there is now a Center for the Promotion of Peace and Conflict Resolution, inspired in part by Steve's life and writing. When the Warner family took me to a local motel after the service and a family reception at their house, I could only speculate what would happen to any of us in the future. For the parents and sister, there would never be a resumption of the life before Vietnam. I recognized how fortunate I was. Of course, I was not completely out of the military. I had to report in the morning to Fort Dix, New Jersey, be processed out of the service. I don't recall any particular anger or frustration at the red tape involved in being issued material, filling out forms, receiving my final pay. After all, I was in my own country. At some point, perhaps that Monday or the next day, I was officially released. I flew from New Jersey to Washington, D.C., and traveled farther to Richmond, only an hour and a half from the little town in which my wife had been teaching school during my absence. There I experienced a final delay. My wife had to work the next day, and it was too late at night to ask her to come pick me up, bring me home, and still be ready for classes in the morning. So I went to the bus station downtown, where a bus would leave at something like 4 in the morning. Again, this was not a painful experience considering where I'd been. At something like 6 the next morning then, I called my wife from the local bus station, and she drove less than a mile to pick me up with all my belongings stuffed into a single duffel bag, and we returned to our apartment. She left almost immediately, and I slept that day, content that all was well and that all would be well. It has been. But there is, among other things, survivor's guilt. I was home safe, others were not, and the meaning of that fundamental fact has, over 40 years, knit its way into my consciousness and become intertwined with my fellow church members' prayer for the fallen men of an earlier war. doing such things as visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in the nation's capital, read accounts of other conflicts, see the nation return to war in the 21st century has inspired me to pray for my generation and to compose a number of stories which I hope may be helpful to others. The stories are not all sad, though some are. Most involve the assimilation of hard choices and unlucky events into productive lives. And these tales also feature those who accept veterans back into their lives after service, often understanding in profound ways what can or must be done for healing to occur. And this is why I urge you to push your story to its conclusion. It's not just for your own sense, the satisfaction of a task completed, but also in order to send out to the world what you have learned and what you want others to consider. If you've drafted 3 portions of the experience so far, I can promise that the remaining 2 will be easier to complete, the downhill of the writing process. So tackle the 4th phase of your subject and send a draft of it on to me. As always, if there are obstacles, let me know about them. But think of yourself as Hector, firm in the knowledge of what must be done and resolute in presenting to Andromache the reasons you must finish the mission. Oh, what is happiness? Oh dear. I've got people I grew up with, I've known for over 60 years. And I know who they are, and I value them, and they make me happy.